A marriage in a city of secrets, Washington, D.C., in the summer of 2000 hummed with ambition. Beneath the gleaming facades of marble monuments and ivy-covered universities, lives intertwined in ways both purposeful and accidental. For Rose Donovan and Mike O'Connor, D.C. was more than home. It was a crucible, testing their love in ways neither could have anticipated. Rose, 34, was a political consultant. Her days were spent crafting campaigns, navigating the murky waters of power, and extinguishing scandals before they spread. Her poised, confident demeanor was an asset in her career, but at home, it often served as a barrier. Beneath the polish, Rose craved connection, yet she had spent years guarding her heart, even from her husband of 7 years. Mike, 37, was her opposite in many ways, a history professor at Georgetown University with a quiet, steady disposition. He was the kind of man who found joy in the pages of old books and solace in teaching students about the lessons of the past. While Rose thrived in the chaos of DC's political world, Mike cherished simplicity. Their marriage, once passionate and full of dreams, had become routine. But routine isn't always safe. The spark, a photograph one humid June evening. As Rose organized her home office, she stumbled upon an old photograph tucked inside a book, stopped her cold. In the picture, a younger Rose stood arm in arm with a man named Daniel, a face she hadn't seen in years but couldn't forget. Daniel had been her colleague during a high-profile political campaign in 1994, and for a brief time, her lover. Their affair had burned hot and fast, ending when Rose discovered Daniel was married. The betrayal had left scars she thought had long since faded. She stared at the photo, memories flooding back. Rose quickly stuffed it into a drawer, her pulse racing. It was a moment from her past she had no intention of revisiting. A fateful fundraiser 3 days later, Rose and Mike attended a high-profile fundraiser in downtown D.C. The room was a symphony of clinking glasses, polite laughter, and whispered deals. Rose, ever the political strategist, moved effortlessly through the crowd, introducing Mike to senators, lobbyists, and aides. As she adjusted her husband's tie in a playful moment, a voice from behind froze her. "Rose Donovan?" She turned, her heart sinking. It was Daniel. Time hadn't erased his sharp features or the confidence in his voice. He extended a hand, his smile charming but guarded. "It's been a long time," Daniel said, his eyes lingering on her. Rose forced a smile. "Daniel." "Yes, it has." Mike, sensing the tension, stepped forward. "And you are?" "An old colleague," Rose said quickly, the words tumbling out. Daniel shook Mike's hand, introducing himself with the easy charm of someone accustomed to defusing awkward situations. "Rose and I worked together on the Hartley campaign back in the day. Good times." The conversation was brief, but the damage was done. For the rest of the night, Rose felt Mike's quiet curiosity gnawing at her. She tried to brush it off, but as they drove home, he finally asked the question she had been dreading. "Who is Daniel, really?" Rose gripped the steering wheel. "Just someone I worked with. It's nothing." Mike didn't press, but his silence spoke volumes. The photograph resurfaces, the tension between them simmered over the next few days. Mike, normally warm and easygoing, became more reserved. He spent long hours in his study, a habit Rose hadn't seen since the early years of their marriage. One evening, as Rose was preparing dinner, she noticed Mike wasn't at the table. Curious, she walked to his study and found the door slightly ajar. Peeking in, she saw him holding the very photograph she'd hidden in the drawer. Her breath caught. "What are you doing?" she asked, stepping into the room. Mike looked up, his face a mix of hurt and confusion. "I found this while looking for a pen. Care to explain why you've kept a picture of him all these years?" "It's nothing," Rose said quickly, reaching for the photo. Mike pulled it back, his tone calm but firm. "You don't keep nothing tucked away in your desk." Rose hesitated, her mind racing. She could see the cracks forming in his trust and knew that the wrong words could shatter it completely. "Daniel was someone I worked with, yes," she admitted. "We were close for a while, but it ended years ago, long before I met you." Mike's jaw tightened. Why didn't you tell me about him? Because it didn't matter, Rose said, her voice trembling. It was in the past. Mike stared at her for a long moment, then set the photograph on the desk. The past has a funny way of catching up, doesn't it? With that, he walked out, leaving Rose standing alone in the room. The call to action. A ghost returns the next day. Rose received an email that made her heart stop. It was from Daniel. Subject: Can we talk? Rose, seeing you at the fundraiser brought back a lot of memories. I know this is sudden, but I'd like to meet, just to talk. Daniel. She closed her laptop, her stomach churning. Daniel reaching out now, after all these years, couldn't be a coincidence. And yet, she felt compelled to respond. Maybe it was guilt, curiosity, or a desire to finally close the chapter of her life that had suddenly been reopened. She agreed to meet him for coffee, choosing a small, out-of-the-way cafe on the edge of the city. When she arrived, Daniel was already there, waiting with the same easy confidence she remembered. Rose, he said, standing to greet her. Thank you for coming. This won't take long, Rose replied, sitting down. Daniel sighed, his expression softening. I owe you an apology for everything. I know I hurt you back then. Rose crossed her arms. Why now, Daniel? Why after all this time? I saw you at the fundraiser and, I don't know, I realized how much I missed you. I just wanted to see you again. Rose's stomach churned. Well, now you have. Is that all? Daniel hesitated, then leaned closer. I never stopped thinking about you. Mike's silent observations unbeknownst to Rose. Mike had followed her to the cafe. He sat across the street in his car, watching through the window as she leaned in close to talk to Daniel. His mind raced. Had she lied about the extent of their relationship? Was this more than a harmless meeting? The sight of her with Daniel reignited insecurities he thought he'd buried long ago. When Rose returned home that evening, Mike didn't confront her. Instead, he withdrew further, his silence heavy with unspoken questions. The distance between them over the weeks following the coffee meeting with Daniel, the cracks in Rose and Mike's marriage deepened. Mike's questions about her past lingered, unspoken but palpable. Rose felt like she was living under a microscope, every action scrutinized. Mike began staying late at Georgetown, diving into research that didn't need his immediate attention. His study, once their sanctuary for long conversations about history and philosophy, now felt like a locked fortress. Rose, meanwhile, threw herself into her work, attending more fundraisers and staying at the office longer. The space between them became more than physical. It was emotional, a chasm they both felt but didn't know how to cross. One evening, after another tense silence at dinner, Mike finally spoke. Do you still think about him? He asked abruptly. Rose froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. What? Daniel, Mike said, his voice steady but cold. Do you still think about him? No, Rose said quickly, setting her fork down. Mike, why are you asking me this? I told you he's in the past. But you saw him, Mike replied, his gaze piercing. And you didn't tell me until I found out on my own. Rose looked away, guilt creeping into her chest. It wasn't important. It was important enough for you to meet him for coffee, Mike countered. Rose opened her mouth to respond but realized she had no defense. Instead, she stood and carried her plate to the sink, avoiding his eyes. A fractured connection. Rose and Mike's routine became more like that of strangers sharing a house than a married couple. They avoided discussing Daniel, but the unspoken tension colored every interaction. Mike stopped joining Rose for her evening walks around the neighborhood, and Rose stopped asking him to. But the distance between them only made Rose more aware of how much she missed him. She found herself lingering outside his study door at night, listening to the faint sounds of pages turning or his pen scratching against paper. She missed the way he used to look at her, like she was the only person who mattered. One night, as she stood outside his study, she gathered her courage and knocked softly. Come in, Mike said, his voice neutral. Rose pushed the door open and stepped inside. He was sitting at his desk, surrounded by stacks of books and papers. Mike, can we talk? She asked hesitantly. He looked up at her, his eyes tired. About what? About us, Rose said, sitting down across from him. I know things have been strained lately, and I hate it. I hate feeling like I'm losing you. Mike leaned back in his chair, studying her. You're not losing me, Rose, but I need to know that I can trust you. You can, Rose said quickly. I swear you can. Then why does it feel like you're still hiding something? Mike asked, his voice quiet but firm. Rose felt a lump form in her throat. Because I'm afraid, she admitted. Afraid of what? Afraid that if you knew everything about me, everything, I wouldn't be the person you fell in love with, Rose said, her voice breaking. Mike was silent for a long moment. Then he reached across the desk and took her hand. I didn't marry you because I thought you were perfect, he said softly. I married you because I loved you. But love isn't enough without trust. Unraveling the past the next day, Rose decided to confront her fears head-on. She began sorting through old boxes in the attic, where she had stored remnants of her life before Mike. As she sifted through old letters, photographs, and campaign memorabilia, she found a journal she had kept during her time on the Hartley campaign, the campaign where she had met Daniel. The entries were raw and unfiltered, detailing her excitement about the campaign, her initial attraction to Daniel, and, eventually, her heartbreak when she discovered his betrayal. Rose sat on the floor of the attic, reading through the journal until the words blurred. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel the pain she had buried. When Mike came home that evening, he found her sitting at the kitchen table, the journal in front of her. What's this? He asked, his brow furrowing. It's my journal from the Hartley campaign, Rose said, her voice steady. I want you to read it. Mike hesitated. Are you sure? Rose nodded. If you're going to understand why I've been so afraid to open up, you need to know everything. Revisiting the campaign as Mike read through the journal, Rose watched him nervously. His expression shifted from curiosity to anger to sadness as he read about her relationship with Daniel. When he finally closed the journal, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with questions. You really loved him, he said quietly. I thought I did, Rose admitted, but it wasn't real. He lied to me, and when I found out he was married, it shattered me. Why didn't you tell me about this before? Mike asked. Because I didn't want you to see me as damaged, Rose said, her voice breaking. I wanted to be strong for you, for us. Mike reached across the table and took her hand. You don't have to be perfect, Rose. I just need you to be honest. The symbolic reconnection in an effort to rebuild their trust. Mike suggested they take a weekend trip to the Shenandoah Valley, a place they had visited during the early days of their marriage. Rose was hesitant at first, but she agreed, hoping the trip would help them reconnect. As they hiked through the lush forests and stood on the edge of scenic overlooks, they began to find their rhythm again. They laughed, shared stories, and held hands like they hadn't in months. One evening, as they sat by a campfire, Mike pulled out a small box. I found this in the attic, he said, opening the box to reveal an old locket. Inside was a photograph of Rose and her late mother. Rose's eyes filled with tears. I thought I lost this years ago. I thought it might help you remember who you are, Mike said softly. Rose smiled, her heart swelling. Thank you, Mike, for everything. The final test, just as Rose and Mike began to find peace, Daniel re-entered their lives. He showed up unannounced at Rose's office, claiming he needed her help. There's something you need to know, Daniel said, his voice urgent. Rose hesitated. I don't think we have anything left to say to each other. It's not about us, Daniel said. It's about the Hartley campaign. There are things I didn't tell you back then. Things that could destroy people's careers, including yours. Rose felt a chill run down her spine. What are you talking about? Daniel handed her a folder filled with documents, emails, financial records, and meeting transcripts that implicated several high-profile politicians in illegal activities. If this gets out, it'll ruin lives, Daniel said, including yours, because your name is all over these documents. Rose stared at the folder, her mind racing. A decision of trust that night, Rose told Mike everything. She showed him the folder and explained Daniel's warning. Mike listened intently, his expression grave. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I don't know," Rose admitted. "If this gets out, it could destroy my career. But if you stay silent, you'll be complicit," Mike said. Rose nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to do the right thing." Mike pulled her into his arms. "You are, and I'll be here no matter what happens." The intrigue revealed Rose decided to turn the documents over to a trusted journalist, exposing the corruption within the Hartley campaign. The fallout was immediate and far-reaching, but Rose found solace in knowing she had done the right thing. Through the ordeal, Mike stood by her side, proving that their bond was stronger than any secret from the past. The breaking point, the tension between Rose and Mike had reached its boiling point. The documents Rose turned over to the journalist were about to be published, threatening to expose one of the most explosive political scandals in Washington, D.C. history. Rose's name, her past involvement in the Hartley campaign, and her connections to Daniel would all be dragged into the public eye. Mike, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, looked over at Rose, who was staring at her phone. "Have they called you yet?" he asked. "No," Rose replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But they will. The story drops tomorrow." Mike set his cup down and crossed the room. "Are you ready for this?" Rose shook her head.
No.
"And I don't know if I ever will be." The weight of what was coming was unbearable. Rose felt like a storm was approaching, and no matter how tightly she held on, she would be swept away. The public bombshell the following morning, the story broke. Headlines blared from every newsstand and TV screen. Hartley campaign scandal. Embezzlement, cover UPS, and a web of lies. Rose's phone rang incessantly. Journalists, colleagues, and even old friends wanted her comment. But the worst blow came when Daniel went on live television, framing himself as a whistleblower and subtly shifting blame toward Rose. "I regret my role in the Hartley campaign," Daniel said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "But I wasn't the only one involved. Rose Donovan was deeply embedded in the operation, and I believe she has questions to answer." Mike turned off the TV, his face a mask of anger. "That bastard threw you under the bus." Rose buried her face in her hands. "I should have seen this coming. He's protecting himself, and I'm the perfect scapegoat." Hellish trials over the next week. Rose's life unraveled. Protesters gathered outside her office, chanting her name alongside accusations of corruption. Her political clients began to sever ties, leaving her without the lifeline of work that had defined her life for a decade. But the worst trial came at home. One evening, Mike came home late, his expression grim. He poured himself a drink and sat across from Rose at the dining table. "We need to talk," he said, his tone heavy. Rose's chest tightened. "What now?" Mike hesitated, then set down his glass. "I got a call today from the dean." Rose's eyes widened. "About me? They're questioning my judgment." "Rose?" Mike said, his voice tinged with frustration. "They think I knew about your involvement in the Hartley campaign and didn't disclose it." Rose's stomach dropped. "Mike, I never wanted this to affect you. It doesn't matter what you wanted," Mike interrupted. "This is our life now. My reputation, my career. It's all tied to this mess." His words cut deep, and for a moment, the silence between them was unbearable. "I can't do this alone," Rose said finally, her voice trembling. "I need you." Mike looked at her, his expression softening. "I'm here, Rose, but you have to fight. You can't just let this destroy you." A symbolic moment of choice the next day, Rose received a call from Emily, her closest friend and confidant. "Rose, I have an idea," Emily said. "But it's risky." "What is it?" Rose asked, desperate for anything that could help. "You need to tell your side of the story," Emily said. "Not through a press release or an interview, directly to the public. Hold a press conference and lay it all out. The truth, the lies, everything." Rose's heart raced at the thought. What if it backfires? Then at least you'll know you tried, Emily said firmly. That evening, Rose sat with Mike, going over what she would say. He listened intently, offering suggestions and reassurance. You can do this, he said, taking her hand. Do you really believe that? Rose asked. Mike smiled. I wouldn't still be here if I didn't. The day of the press conference was gray and drizzling, mirroring Rose's mood. As she stepped onto the podium, cameras flashed, and reporters jostled for position. She took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium. Good afternoon, she began, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. My name is Rose Donovan, and I want to set the record straight. Over the next 20 minutes, Rose told her story. She admitted to her mistakes during the Hartley campaign but clarified her role, emphasizing that she had no knowledge of the illegal activities Daniel and others had orchestrated. I was young and naive, she said, but I was not complicit in the crimes that took place. I made the choice to bring this information to light because it was the right thing to do, even knowing the personal cost. When she finished, there was a beat of silence before the questions began. Rose answered each one calmly, refusing to let the reporters rattle her. In the crowd, Mike watched, pride swelling in his chest. The intrigue revealed as the press conference ended. A familiar figure stepped forward from the back of the crowd. Daniel. Rose, he called out, his voice carrying over the din of reporters. The crowd parted as Daniel approached, flanked by his own media entourage. Why don't you tell them about the ledger? Daniel said, his tone accusatory. Rose froze. What are you talking about? Daniel smirked. The ledger you turned over to the journalist. The one that implicates half of DC. You want to pretend you're the hero, but you were part of it too, weren't you? Gasps rippled through the crowd as reporters shouted questions. Rose stepped back, stunned. But before she could respond, Mike stepped forward, placing himself between Rose and Daniel. Enough, Mike said, his voice commanding. You've done enough damage. Rose did the right thing. Can you say the same? Daniel faltered, the confidence in his smirk fading. You're pathetic, Mike continued, throwing blame at her because you can't face your own guilt. This is on you, Daniel, not her. The crowd erupted as Mike led Rose away from the chaos. The aftermath back at home, Rose broke down in tears. I don't know if I can keep doing this, she said, her voice cracking. Mike wrapped his arms around her. You can. You've already faced the worst of it. And you didn't back down. Rose looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you. Mike smiled. We're in this together. Always. A final twist later that night, Rose received an anonymous email with an attachment. She opened it cautiously, her breath catching as she read the contents. It was a series of emails between Daniel and another high-ranking political figure, detailing a plan to pin the Hartley scandal on Rose. Mike, Rose called out, her voice shaking. He joined her, reading over her shoulder. This changes everything, he said. Rose nodded, her determination returning. It's not over yet. The fallout the anonymous email Rose received was a bombshell. The attached emails between Daniel and a high-ranking political figure revealed a coordinated plan to implicate her in the Hartley campaign scandal. Rose sat at her kitchen table, staring at the screen while Mike paced the room behind her. This proves everything, she whispered. Daniel was trying to save himself all along. Mike stopped pacing and leaned over her shoulder. We can take this to the journalist who broke the story. They'll see the truth. Rose nodded but hesitated. But will anyone believe it? After all that's happened, it feels like people have already made up their minds. Mike knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. You can't control what people believe. You can only control the truth. And this is your chance to take back your story. A strategic counterattack Rose and Mike worked late into the night, preparing the evidence for release. They drafted a statement to accompany the documents, ensuring they told the full story, no matter how painful it was. Rose knew she had to confront her mistakes head-on if she wanted to reclaim her credibility. The next morning, The journalist who had published the original story received Rose's new evidence. The response was immediate. Within hours, headlines shifted from condemning Rose to exposing Daniel and his accomplices. News outlets buzzed with the revelation that Daniel had orchestrated the smear campaign to protect himself and higher-ups in the political establishment. But as the tide turned, Rose faced a new challenge: rebuilding her life. The cost of truth, the fallout from the Hartley scandal, was far-reaching. High-ranking officials were arrested, careers were destroyed, and the political world in D.C. trembled. Rose, despite being vindicated, wasn't spared from the consequences. Many of her clients had already moved on, unwilling to take the risk of being associated with her name. "Reputation takes years to build and seconds to lose," Emily said one evening as they sat on Rose's back porch, sipping wine. "But you did the right thing, Rose. That's what matters." Rose smiled faintly. "I know. I just didn't realize how much it would cost." Emily leaned closer. "Sometimes doing the right thing costs everything. But in the end, you'll have something no one else can take: your integrity." Repairing the bonds that matter. While Rose struggled to rebuild her career, she focused on repairing the most important relationship in her life: her marriage. For weeks, she and Mike worked through the emotional wreckage the scandal had caused. Their arguments were raw but productive, and their conversations delved deeper than they ever had before. One evening, as they walked along the National Mall, Mike stopped and turned to her. "Do you know why I didn't leave, even when everything fell apart?" Rose shook her head, her throat tightening. "Why?" "Because I love you," Mike said. "Not the polished version of you or the person you think you need to be. I love you. The messy, complicated, brilliant you." Tears welled in Rose's eyes as she reached for his hand. "And I love you. I just hope I haven't made it impossible for you to trust me." Mike squeezed her hand. "Trust isn't about never making mistakes. It's about proving you're willing to do the work to make things right. And you've done that." A life reimagined. Months passed, and while the chaos of the scandal began to fade from the headlines, its impact lingered. Rose found herself at a crossroads, unsure of how to move forward in a city that had once defined her. The career she had built so carefully felt tainted, and the thought of returning to the political world filled her with dread. One day, Mike surprised her with a proposal. Not a marriage proposal, but an idea for a fresh start. "You've always been amazing at helping people tell their stories," he said. "What if you used that talent for something new? Something that matters to you?" Rose considered his words. She had spent years crafting narratives for politicians, spinning their truths to fit agendas. But what if she could use those skills to help people whose voices weren't being heard? A new purpose inspired by Mike's suggestion, Rose launched a nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering women in underserved communities to advocate for themselves. She poured her energy into the project, finding a renewed sense of purpose in helping others. The work was challenging but fulfilling. Rose traveled across the country, meeting women from all walks of life, listening to their stories, and giving them the tools to make their voices heard. For the first time in years, she felt like she was doing something meaningful, something that mattered beyond the confines of power and politics. The intrigue resolved one day, while sorting through old files for her nonprofit. Rose came across a letter she hadn't noticed before. It was in her father's handwriting, tucked inside a box of personal papers she had kept from her childhood home. The letter was dated 2 months before her father's death. In it, he wrote about his regrets, his pride in Rose, and his fears for her future. But one line stood out: "Never let someone else write your story. Your truth is your power." Rose sat quietly, the words sinking in. Her father's advice felt like it had been written for this moment, a reminder that the chaos of the past didn't define her. She was in control of her narrative now. The puzzle comes together as Rose reflected on her journey. The pieces of her life began to fit together. Every mistake, every betrayal, every trial had led her to this point. She had lost her career, faced public humiliation, and nearly lost her marriage. But she had also gained something far more valuable: clarity. The scandals, the lies, and even Daniel's betrayal had forced her to confront the parts of herself she had been avoiding. She had learned to let go of the need for perfection, to embrace vulnerability, and to fight for what truly mattered. And through it all, Mike had been her anchor. Their love, tested by fire, had emerged stronger and more authentic than ever. A quiet victory one evening, as Rose and Mike sat on their porch watching the sunset, she turned to him and smiled. "Do you ever think about how we got here?" she asked. Mike chuckled. "Every day." Rose leaned against his shoulder, feeling the weight of the past finally lifting. "It wasn't easy, was it?" "No," Mike said, "but nothing worth having ever is." Final reflection: Rose's story wasn't just about love or scandal. It was about resilience. It was about the courage to face the truth, the strength to rebuild after everything fell apart, and the power of choosing love even when it felt impossible. In the end, Rose realized that life wasn't about avoiding mistakes or pain. It was about what you did after, how you turned your trials into triumphs, how you chose to grow instead of crumble. And for anyone willing to listen, that was the moral she hoped her story would convey. Your truth is your power, and your resilience is your victory.